Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida, Department of Criminal Justice, and I'd like to take a few minutes and discuss cold cases. And much of this discussion will be from an excellent article by Davis, Jensen, Burgett, and Burnett, published in 2014 in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, volume 59, pages 375 to 382, called Working Smarter on Cold Cases, Identifying Factors Associated with Successful Cold Case Investigations. So here they're beginning to look at conducting some research on what seems to be factors that lead to successfully solving cold cases. So let's get right into their study and then discuss some of the findings and the implications. They first note that there has been a decline in homicide clearance rates, which seems kind of strange at first because you would think with our greater technology, our greater surveillance, our sophisticated scientific techniques and strategies that we'd actually be solving a higher percentage of homicide cases, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And we might ask, well, why? And they have several explanations. For example, that there's been an increase in stranger-related crimes. So think about that, how that's different than looking at or investigating crimes or homicides where it's someone that was known. There was a relationship between the victim and perpetrator, for example. Also, there's been an increase in firearm use and specific types of firearms, and that's been problematic for investigatory purposes. There's also been an increase in cases that have multiple felonies and an increase in drug and gang-related homicides. And in those drug and gang-related homicides, of course, you're less likely to have witnesses that will come forward with information about what they saw related to the crime. There's also been a decrease in trust in law enforcement, a decrease in community cohesion, and all of this leading to a backlog of cases. So we run into this big problem of having a large number of cold cases. And they also ask, well, how are cold cases handled by law enforcement agencies? And this, of course, depends on each individual agency. And they found basically that agencies are quite diverse in how they address cold cases and their policies and their procedures and practices. But they ask the question, really, for our interest today is what leads to resolving cold case? And in their study, they looked at homicide cases that were cleared and those that were unsolved. And they wanted to see if there were some differences there. And the data that they collected in their study included a bunch of variables of relevance. For example, they looked at victim characteristics such as the age and gender of the victim and whether or not they were a gang member. They looked at the crime context, for example, where the body was discovered and how the victim was killed. They looked at the motivation, for example, was it a feud or was it related to theft? They also looked at human capital factors, such as whether someone identified a suspect or if there were eyewitnesses that were forthcoming with information. They also looked at the physical evidence, for example, if there were recovered weapons or if there were prints left at the scene. They also looked at the basis for the cold case investigation. Was it because of a certain period of time had gone by and they took a closer look again? Or did the family inquire about how the case was proceeding? Or was there new information, for example, that they obtained? And then also cold case actions. For example, did they re-interview witnesses or did they conduct new tests for evidence? And were they able to use investigative databases that they may have not had access to when the crime occurred? So what they found in terms of what leads to resolving these cold cases were factors, for example, that the victim was a gang member, that there was an identification of a prime suspect, that there's also a disclosure of the motivation of the perpetrator. There's new physical evidence that slugs were recovered at the crime scene, that that additional witnesses were interviewed, and that there were follow-up leads, and also that there was funding. So these factors led to solving cold cases. Again, if you think about how they all work together, and you know, think about funding, follow-up leads, new evidence, having witnesses come forward after some time. But what decreased the likelihood of solving a case? They found that the victim was African American, the victim was a prostitute, the victim was a drug user, and there was no evidence of a struggle in the homicide, and there was a family inquiry about it. So those, I think, we need to address very carefully why some groups, cold cases, are less likely to be solved than others, and what are some of the reasons behind that. And also, what really threw me is a family inquiry. You know, so we have to look at that in more detail, of course. And you know, that may be related to a variety of factors. Of course, there's different types of cold cases, and they talk about several. They talk about the classical, where there's a family or the media inquiry, and or there's a time frame for a review. And these tend to be the least common, and that might also be related to why we see low rates for that. Then the second is where there's availability of forensic evidence, where there's new DNA testing and databases. This is becoming much more common. And we've seen a couple cases recently where law enforcement was able to match a DNA sample of the perpetrator in a genetic family type database and see who they matched with family members, and then discover who the perpetrator was. So that's a whole other topic in itself. That's a lot more recent. I think the Golden State Killer was the one that has come to our attention more recently, and you know, that's a fascinating case. And there's already been several books written about that, a bunch of articles as well. And that is more common now. And also, what's more common is that the perpetrator confesses or there's new eyewitnesses. So we're seeing that occur as well. So, what the strange thing is I actually made the first video on cold cases. First, I had put together the PowerPoint and read some articles, and I've actually been working on this for about a year, which seems you know, you guys are probably thinking, wow, he's been working on this PowerPoint for a year and this video for a year. Hopefully he's been doing something else besides this, and yeah, I have, but it seemed like I just could not get it right. Now, there were a few times where animals came into the room and disturbed the camera, and I had to start over. But then also there were times where I just couldn't get it right for some reason. But there are a few things I wanted to mention. Why even have this video on cold cases? What motivated me to do this was simply my students. And that is, one of our coordinators talks to students all the time about their interests, their needs, you know, what can we do to provide for the best education possible? Are we missing any topics? And several students said, yes, cold cases. We want more information about cold cases. So because I teach these courses, serial murder, criminal profiling, violent crimes and criminals, etc., I was asked to go ahead and include a section on cold cases. So here it is. And then, of course, the second question, you know, which seems kind of strange, is, okay, I've never worked in law enforcement, so what would I know about cold cases? Well, I worked for a number of years at a hospital that worked very closely with law enforcement, with sex crimes, with child abuse, neglect, and also worked for a private agency that worked a lot on violent crimes. And what I found in many of my cases is that that there was never an arrest of a perpetrator, and many times when there was an arrest of a perpetrator, prosecution was not successful, or that they dropped the case because there wasn't enough evidence. And so I consider these cases sometimes to be unresolved, especially in those cases where there wasn't a perpetrator and there was a victim. And some of these are very difficult because of the age of the victim in trying to conduct the interview. And so when I look back, basically I look back and thought, wow, of all the criminal cases I've worked on, very few resulted in arrest and even less in prosecution. That's just the nature of it. Let me mention a few cases real quick that were extremely frustrating that I worked on. One was back a long time ago at a party, a clown sexually abused a child at a birthday party, and no one knew who this clown was because they wore a clown outfit and everything, and they were paid in cash, and it wasn't clear how they were recruited, and no one could trace who it was. And so this was quite disturbing in terms of not being able to discover the identity of the perpetrator. That I know that frustrated me significantly because I wanted that person, that child molester, to be arrested and prosecuted, but we had no idea who that person was. And so I worked other cases where similar dynamics were occurring, so I can kind of see how frustrating it must be for these law enforcement officers who spend countless hours trying to solve these cases, but there's just not enough evidence, or there's not eyewitnesses, or there's just these factors that play in there. And we're even seeing sometimes cases are solved 10, 15, 20, 30 years later. I've been working on a case trying to figure it out, and I'll never figure it out, of a homicide, multiple homicides that occurred in the 1940s. And I go back at it every 3 or 4 years. I maybe try to read something new on it, try to do some research. It's pretty clear I'm never going to find out the perpetrators. It's also very clear that the perpetrators are dead. But I still wanted to know what had happened, and can't do that. We see these cases sometimes with serial murders, sometimes cases go cold, and sometimes they're resolved years and years later. I think one area that would be really helpful and important, and I've read some articles about this being done at some other universities, and this would be really, I think, a cool thing to do. Very helpful, I think, to the community, to law enforcement, and especially students, is to have students do internships in police departments where they work on cold cases, and work with a detective or an officer or someone, to go back and take a close look at that cold case and see if there's new information, new leads, or anything that they can add to it that has transpired since. And so I think that's kind of, I think, the ideal situation is to match the scientific research, the academic aspects, with the practical expert knowledge that those that are investigating these cases have. I remember working in a missing children case years ago, and I didn't go out in the field, but I actually had a couple officers, they were spending a whole day walking around a swamp looking for bodies. And so, these are situations that are extremely important to not only, bring justice, but also to help the families that have to face this situation. But I'm confident that we're going to keep pushing forward with the new technology, with the interest that students have in solving these cases, with the interest that law enforcement has. Of course, the bottom line, I think, is funding, and that seems to be a big issue. So hopefully, these agencies will be able to be funded so they can actually carry out that work. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.